Hi, and welcome to Microbiology. My name is Dr. Rosario, and I am going to be your guide this semester as we study the microscopic world. So today, I am going to give you an introduction to the world of microbiology. What is it that we're going to be studying throughout this semester? I have a couple of goals for today. The first is just to define for you what do we mean by microbiology? What are we going to be studying this semester? And then I'm going to talk about microbes and how they impact our everyday lives. So microbiology, what does that word mean? Well, we have micro, which means small, and then we have biology, which is the study of living things, right? So microbiology is the study of small living things. But let's think about that. What do we mean by small? Well, the human eye can see things as small as 0.1 millimeters, which is about the width of a single human hair, all right? In this class, we are going to be learning about organisms that are smaller than that, which means we can't see them with our eyes, and we're going to have to use a microscope to be able to view them. So to refine our definition, that definition now is microbiology is the study of living things too small to see with the unaided or naked human eye, right? Those things that we have to view using a microscope. As we study microbiology, we're going to encounter 7 different major groups of microorganisms, and those are listed here. So bacteria, archaea, fungi, protozoa, algae, multicellular animal parasites, and viruses and prions. And we're going to talk about each one of those a little bit so you can see the differences between them. So the first group is our bacteria, and this is probably what you most commonly think of when you think of microbiology. These are small prokaryotic cells. So these are single-celled microorganisms, and they don't have a nucleus, right? So hopefully you remember that from your introductory biology course. Prokaryotes are cells without nuclei. Eukaryotes are cells with nuclei. Bacteria have a unique cell wall structure. It's called peptidoglycan, and we're going to learn about that this semester. And they reproduce asexually through binary fission. You can see in this picture here we have a bacterium that is kind of a long rod-shaped bacteria, and it kind of continually divides, creating these long chains of cells. Bacteria can use a variety of different sources for their energy to survive. So they can use organic chemicals just like we do, so they can, eat food. They can use inorganic chemicals, or they can even perform photosynthesis. So they are very diverse in terms of their metabolism. Another group of organisms that you've probably heard of but don't know much about is our archaea. Archaea are also prokaryotes, and they were actually originally lumped together with bacteria until we realized that they're actually very different in terms of their cell structure and even some of their lifestyles. So they're prokaryotic, but they don't have peptidoglycan cell walls. They have cell walls composed of something just a little bit different that we call pseudomurine. You're not going to have to remember that for a test. Just know that they have a different cell wall. They live in extreme environments. So what you see in this picture here is a picture of Grand Prismatic, which is a hot spring in Yellowstone National Park. Now, if you've never been to Yellowstone, what you should know about it is it's on top of a mega volcano. Sorry, it's this gigantic volcano that hasn't erupted for millions of years. All right, in this volcano, there's different spots where the heat of the volcano kind of creeps up to the surface. So one of those spots is the Old Faithful geyser. You may have seen pictures of that, where you see water shooting up into the sky at regular intervals. But close by to Old Faithful is this hot spring, Grand Prismatic. And the water in this spring is very, very hot. right? If you were to fall into this spring, you would not survive because it's just that hot. Now, the interesting thing about this spring is that you see these bright, beautiful colors, the blues and the greens around the edges and even the orange. Those colors are due to the microorganisms that are living in that hot spring. Most of these microorganisms are archaea. They're what we call extremophiles, right? They love living in extreme environments. In the case of Grand Prismatic, the archaea that are there are known as thermophiles because they like a very hot environment. But other archaea can live in very salty environments. We call them halophiles. And then even others are able to use methane gas as they are surviving. So those are known as methanogens. So we have a lot of different kind of unique lifestyles that we see within this group of microorganisms. We will not talk much about archaea this semester as we talk about human health, primarily because we don't understand the role of archaea in human health. There are no known human diseases caused by this group of microorganisms as far as we know, but they're also not very well studied or understood because they're very difficult to grow in the laboratory. All right, so our next group of microorganisms is our fungi. Fungi you're probably pretty familiar with. These are things like molds, right? Mushrooms, yeast, those are all fungi. Now, they are eukaryotic, which means their cells have a nucleus, and they have chitin cell walls. So from a chemical perspective, chitin is much more simple than peptidoglycan. It's just these repeating chains of modified glucose. Your fungi use organic chemicals for energy. So they feed off of materials produced by other organisms. So in the example in your picture, you have the fungi growing on the orange. They're using the chemicals that were produced by the orange tree in order to survive and grow. So molds and mushrooms are multicellular. Yeasts are single-celled, unicellular. And there are a lot of different human diseases that can be caused by fungi. So we're going to be talking about a few of those this semester. Our next group is our protozoans, and this is a very diverse group. There's lots of different types of protozoans. What they all have in common is they are eukaryotic and they are single-celled. Right? And the picture that you see here is one of my favorite protozoans. This is Giardia lamblia. It is a microorganism that causes a disease I like to affectionately call beaver fever. Right? So when hikers go out into the woods and they run out of water, they get really thirsty, they might take a drink from a local stream. Well, unfortunately, that local stream is also the toilet for your beavers and bears and other mammals that live in the forest. And it may contain these protozoans, these Giardia lamblia, that can cause a really awful diarrheal disease. So that's why we call it beaver fever. It tends to be associated with people who spend a lot of time outdoors. Pets can also get this illness, so dogs are prone to Giardia. It's a pretty interesting disease, and maybe we'll get a chance to talk about it later in the semester. So protozoans, they are able to absorb or ingest organic chemicals. So we call organisms that survive on organic chemicals for food, we call them heterotrophs. So protozoans are heterotrophs. We are heterotrophs. We use organic chemicals for energy. Our protozoans, they move, or they may move, and when they do, they can use a variety of different ways to get around. You can see Giardia in this picture uses flagella, those long whip-like tail structures, but other protozoans may use what are known as pseudopodia, which are kind of foot-like structures where they kind of ooze across a surface. Think an amoeba in that situation. Or even they might use short hair-like structures that cover the surface of the cell called cilia. So protozoans are really interesting. There's a lot of different types of them, and there are a fair number of human diseases caused by protozoans. Our next group is algae. Now, algae don't generally cause human disease. There are a couple of exceptions to that rule. Algae are very similar to plants. They are eukaryotic and they have cellulose cell walls. They get energy from the sun through photosynthesis, but algae tend to live in aquatic environments, either saltwater or freshwater. They do produce a lot of molecular oxygen, so a lot of the air that we breathe is produced by algae, and they serve as primary producers. So they take the energy of the sun and they use that energy to build biological molecules, things like proteins, carbohydrates, and lipids. Other organisms eat algae, right? So we see that algae are at the bottom of the food chain. An example of an organism that might eat algae are your clams and your oysters and your shrimp, your shellfish. Well, one example of a disease that can be caused by algae is something called paralytic shellfish poisoning. Now, algae can produce some chemicals that are poisonous, right? Poisonous to us or poisonous to other animals. And as those toxins accumulate within the bodies of other organisms, if we eat those organisms, like shellfish, that can make us sick. So that's what paralytic shellfish poisoning is. It's not that we're eating the algae directly, but we're eating the shellfish that ate the algae. Another example of algae that can affect human health that has been in the news lately, particularly in Florida, is the algae that produce what's called red tide. So these are algae that grow in abundance when there's a lot of phosphorus and nitrogen in the environment, and that can alter the environment of the water. It can reduce the oxygen levels in the water, and that can result in a fish kill. And that can have very detrimental effects on the ecosystem where the algae blooms occur. In addition, what will happen is as those animals that live in that ecosystem start to die off, you get a lot of different chemicals that get released into the air. So what happens with red tide is humans can often have allergic reactions to the byproducts of those algae blooms. So in that case, it's not an infection or an intoxication so much, but it's an environmental interaction. So in the case of algae, they don't infect humans. They don't actually grow in our bodies, but they can have detrimental effects on our health. Our next group is our multicellular animal parasites. Now, these are my favorite. I mean, they're really my favorite. I love parasites. I just think they're really interesting. They are eukaryotic and they can be quite large. So we can see some of these parasites with the naked eye, but at some point in their lives, whether it's at an egg stage or a larval stage, they are microscopic. So these are multicellular animals. They are eukaryotes. And we call them kind of collectively helminths. Helminths is kind of a broad term to describe worms, all right? And there are three main groups of worms that can cause disease in humans, and we're going to talk about those as we get further on through this chapter and into the next one. Helminths are really interesting. They have very complex life cycles. And like I said, I love them. I think they're really cool. This picture that you see in front of you is a picture of a tapeworm. Tapeworms can be up to 8 feet long. They can be quite large. And they're often associated with foodborne illness. So like I said, we'll talk about these this semester because I can get really distracted and excited about them. All right, the next group of organisms, or I shouldn't even use the word organism. The next group of microbes is our viruses. Viruses are not alive. They're not defined as living things because they are not composed of cells. They do consist of biological material, however. They have protein and they have some nucleic acid, whether it's DNA or RNA. Right? They may have some lipids that surround that protein and nucleic acid. But viruses cannot replicate on their own. They cannot reproduce on their own. They can only reproduce when they are inside of another host cell. And I'm sure we're all very interested in viruses right now, given the COVID-19 pandemic. So we will spend plenty of time this semester talking about viruses. Okay, so that's kind of an overview of different microorganisms. When you think of microbes, and I know for me, for much of my life, when I thought of microbes, I thought of them in terms of causing disease, right? The human view of microbes is that you have these microorganisms, they interact with us, and they make us sick. But I want to expand your point of view a little bit, because microbes are so much more than just what we call pathogens or disease-causing microorganisms. Microbes shape the world as we know it. So the world that we live in, everything that we see around us, that is here because of microorganisms. So I love this graphic. It takes all of the history of the planet and it puts it into the scale of a single year. So January 1st would be the Big Bang. December 31st would be today, midnight. December 31st would be today, right? So you've got all of the history of the universe compressed into a single year time scale. And when you look at that time scale, you have the beginnings of life starting in September. Everything up to that point is all kind of the development of the solar system and then the early stages of the development of our planet. So we start to see life emerge in our universe around September. And all the way from September through December, right? So most of the history of life has been microscopic. So all of the living things up through this time period are going to be single-celled microscopic organisms, right? It's not until you get up into the second half of December that we start to see organisms that are multicellular starting to emerge in the fossil record. So all of the history of life, the vast majority of it has been dominated by microscopic organisms. Microorganisms have literally shaped our planet, right? They drive the structure and the composition of our planet. The first thing I want to point out is our cyanobacteria, right? Our blue-green algae, which we can see in this picture in the upper left side of your screen there. Cyanobacteria, they perform photosynthesis, and a byproduct of photosynthesis is oxygen, right? 70% of the world's oxygen is due to microscopic organisms performing photosynthesis. We tend to think about plants and trees producing oxygen, but really it's our algae and our cyanobacteria that are producing most of the oxygen on our planet. In addition, microorganisms are incredibly important in terms of microbial decomposition, right? Breaking down dead and dying materials in plants and animals. So you can see we have a decomposing, I think that's a pig in that picture, right? Microbes take the nutrients and the elements that were incorporated into living things, and they return those nutrients back into a form that can be used by other organisms. In addition, you have microorganisms that make those nutrients available for the next group of organisms. So what you see in the bottom here in this picture is some plant roots. And you see those little nodules that are on the plant roots. Each one of those little nodules or round structures is filled with bacteria called rhizobium. And those rhizobium bacteria, what they do is they take the nitrogen in the soil and they convert it into ammonia that the plant can use. These plants cannot survive without their microorganisms that live in symbiosis with them, that make those nutrients available to them. So microbes have a very important role within the ecology of our planet. In terms of the human relationship with microorganisms, the first thing I want to point out is biotechnology, right? So biotechnology, let's define that real quick. That is the human use of microorganisms to make a product. Usually when we think of biotechnology, we think about it in an industrial setting, but biotechnology is something that has been used ever since the kind of beginnings of mankind, right? The production of cheese and beer and wine, that is all an example of biotechnology, right? Food science. Genetic engineering is an example of biotechnology, right? So now we have this technology we call CRISPR that is used to help cure, hopefully, genetic diseases. That can only be done through work with microorganisms and other forms of what we call recombinant DNA technology. The production of insulin that we use for diabetics, that comes from using microorganisms, right? We produce that insulin using microorganisms. Another example of the human use of microbes is a process called bioremediation. This is where we use microorganisms to clean up our messes, right? Our sewage treatment plants are really giant factories where we use bacteria to break down human waste. We can use bacteria to clean up toxic waste. We can use it to break down oil spills, right? In those examples, in bioremediation, we're using microorganisms to clean up our messes. Of course, we like to think in this class a lot about the role of microbes in human health. So there's two different ways we can look at microbes in the context of human health. We can look at the positive influence of microbes on our health, and this is where we're learning a lot about the role of the microorganisms that live in and on our body every day. This is what we call the human microbiome. And right now they have identified about 5,000 different species of bacteria that live in and on our bodies. That's a lot of different microorganisms, right? And one of the important things we're beginning to understand is that if we disrupt that ecosystem, right, if we alter the organisms that live in our body, that can in itself lead to disease. And we're learning a lot about that. So the human microbiome, these organisms that naturally live in our body, from a microbiology perspective, we haven't focused a lot on them. Most of the history of microbiology has focused on disease-causing microorganisms, what we call pathogenic organisms. But now our focus is shifting so that we're trying to understand more about those organisms that we've kind of taken for granted over the years. Now, pathogenic microorganisms are important. Of course, they cause a lot of different diseases, and we're going to learn about some of those this semester. There are about 2,000 different microorganisms that can cause human disease. We're not going to cover all of them in this class, but we will touch on the really important ones and the ones that are really interesting. Okay, so the study of microorganisms can encompass a lot of different things. We can study the structure and the function of the cells, how they grow, how they process nutrients, their physiology. We can study the genetics of microorganisms, how information is passed from one generation to the next. We can study their taxonomy and their classification and how they've evolved over time. And then, of course, we can study how microorganisms interact with each other, interact with other living things, and interact with the non-living environment. So there's lots of different angles that we can approach this from. So within the field of microbiology, there are several subfields or subdisciplines. In this class, we're going to focus a lot on medical microbiology, right? The study of microorganisms within the context of human health. How microorganisms cause disease. How can we treat those diseases? How can we prevent those diseases? A lot of that falls under the category of medical microbiology, diagnosing disease caused by microorganisms. Public health microbiology is related. This is where we study the spread of diseases and how to control those diseases. We've focused a lot of on that over the last year as we've watched the spread of COVID-19, right? This is where epidemiology fits in. Immunology is the study of the human immune response to microorganisms. So, of course, that's going to be kind of in the overall field of microbiology. It fits in there. Industrial microbiology, like I said, biotechnology is the use of microorganisms to produce a product. So you can study microbiology in the industrial context. You can study microbiology in the context of farming, so agricultural microbiology. That includes plant pathogens, right? Those that cause disease in our plants, but also in the context of those microorganisms that are necessary for our plants to survive. And then finally, you have the field of environmental microbiology, which is really looking at the role of microbes within the global environment and the different nutrients that they recycle and the different products they produce within the environment. So again, in this lecture, my goal was really just to give you an introduction to the field of microbiology. We defined it for you. We talked about some of those major groups and the disciplines that are included within the study of those organisms too small to see with the naked eye. And then we talked a little bit about the role of microorganisms. Hopefully you can see that it's a very broad field. There's a lot of different things we can look at when we think about studying microorganisms. Again, this semester we're really going to focus on the impact of microorganisms on human health because most of my students are going to be going into nursing or other allied health fields. So that's why we kind of focus our attention on that. But I do want you to see that microbes are so much more than just organisms that can cause disease.